You might recognize me from the screen that was just on. We're going to start this evening with Dr. Anna-Leah King, who will give us a welcome, and then I'll pop back in, and then we'll have our first speaker tonight. Again, thank you.
Hello to everyone. I bring you greetings. Thank you for coming to our ancestral lands. Mina speak you for M-pee-a-sem, home of the Soto Anishinaabe, the Nahachewsky, Lakota, Dakota, and the M-pee-a-sem, we call them the Métis. Tawau means welcome, and so Tawau to Dr. Cynthia Dillard and Dr. Joe Westheimer. I have a little story to share about education. I'd like to say that as an Indigenous person in my family, we had three generations of teachers. My great-grandmother, who ran the one-room schoolhouse on the res, and my father, who became a teacher, and then teacher of elementary school and high school children, and eventually taught at the university in education. Dr. Cecil King, the late Dr. Cecil King. We also have three generations of doctors in my family. My father was a doctor before we worked for the Faculty of Education at the University of Saskatchewan. And I'm a doctor here at U of R. And my daughter just finished medical school. And she's working as a resident. She's a resident doctor at a hospital in downtown Vancouver. And she hopes to extend her residency an additional year in order to cover emergency med. So my father was so proud of her. I just wanted to share those words to say that Indigenous people across Canada are still reeling from the tragedy of land relocation and Indian residential school. And in spite of the legacy of death and harm and abuse, we have more doctors graduating from the universities than we've ever had. We are still less than 1% in the population overall, which is a teeny tiny percent. But hopefully we'll get over 1% and we'll be 50%. I want to say too that my father is going to be honored for being the creator and founder of the Indigenous Teacher Education Program at the University of Saskatchewan. They're going to name the student lounge in his honor. And our former elder, Joe Nahachewsky, will do a pipe ceremony for us. And then we'll have official greetings and a naming ceremony. So, I also would like to say that my father wrote 2 books, and one of them is 2 histories. One is Balancing 2 Worlds, a Siganok in a certain time period in the 1800s that eludes me, and The Boy from Buzzlaw, A Life in Indian Education. So these are 2 great texts. If you are interested, they're totally worth reading, because you get a caption of the people, the Indigenous people of Saskatchewan, who were forthright in trying to create education as a treaty right and have their students come through the teaching programs, social work programs, nursing programs, every kind of program. We now in this province have 3,000 Indigenous teachers, well over 3,000. So that's a win. Yes, to all my relations, I leave some blessing words. So I'd like to say, Indigo, Gawikina Mikina, straight is our pathway. Go ikma deny win. Straight are our thoughts that we gather. Go ikma ainahupideain. Straight is our heart. And go ikma dinajim. So that straight will be our words. And this is a blessing for Kathy and Joel, or Cynthia and Joel, for their presentations that they're doing for us tonight. These are my words. Miigwech.
Thank you for starting us off in such a good way, Anna-Leah. It's my absolute pleasure to be hosting tonight. This is the first in a series of presentations and talks that will be sponsored through the Faculty of Education in recognition of the University of Regina's 50th anniversary. We are extremely proud as a faculty to be hosting both Cynthia and Joel tonight. The theme, of course, is the possibility of education. And 50 years ago, or a little bit more, most of this was just a possibility in terms of the University of Regina and the Faculty of Education. So we're very, very pleased and honored to be able to have all of you come here tonight. I want to point out a few people specifically. Dr. Jeff Cashin has joined us this evening. Thank you for joining us, President of the University of Regina. We have, I believe, Dr. David Gregory, who is the Provost. I also want to recognize all of my colleagues who I kind of see through the spotlight here. All the students and, of course, our wonderful community members, educators, teachers who are here. And I specifically want to thank Dr. Mark Spooner, who's organized this evening and been a wonderful host for both Cynthia and Joel, and also Lori Lindsay, who's done a tremendous amount of organizational work for this evening and for our future talks and presentations. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Cynthia Dillard as our first speaker. I do want to mention also that both Cynthia and Joel will be taking questions from anybody who's interested. There's a mic here, but we'll do it after both individuals present this evening. So, Dr. Cynthia Dillard is Dean of the College of Education at Seattle University. Her scholarly research interests include critical teacher education, spirituality in education, and African American feminist studies. Beyond numerous published articles, book chapters, and scholarly presentations across the globe, two of her books on spiritual strivings, transforming an African American woman's academic life, and learning to remember the things that we've learned to forget, Endarkened Feminisms, Spirituality, and the Sacred Nature of Research, were selected as Critics' Choice Book Award winners by the American Educational Studies Association. Dr. Dillard is a visionary leader who continues to make impacts in education across the state of Washington, the Pacific Northwest, United States, and of course the world. We're so pleased to welcome Dr. Dillard.
Good evening, people. Good people. Thank you. I have to get organized here first. Oh, that's not gonna work. Let's try this. Slides are there. Again, thank you so much for being here this evening, and special thanks to the College of Education here at the University of Regina, and my very particular thanks to Mark Spooner and the Dean and all who have made this day possible. I also want to thank my friend, my new friend, for the blessings that were just given for these words. For we wake up in the morning because we still have work to do, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to share some of that work with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some stuff that might appear that it should be in a church space. In this hollow ground, it probably is as close to a church space as I might get of late. But I do think that there's a need to really speak truth and speak out loud about the nature of the very sacred work that we're doing as educators, and that is part of the possibility of an education that actually liberates. So this talk tonight is in three parts. The first part is trying to outline and maybe lift up some ideas that I've been thinking about for a while around the notion of covenants, N-A-N-T-S, covenants, that we make in education and in society. The second part of the talk is really about some examples of the ways that education has or has not served particular groups of folks in our society, whether in Canada or the US. And then the last part is really that piece around hope. It's that piece around what's possible in education. And I think there's a moment right now, post-pandemic, post-everything, where we have the chance to really shake things up a bit, to take apart structures that don't work, and to build new structures that are really about the freedom and liberation of all. So let me start with the first part. It's called New Covenants. And pardon me if I don't get the slides quite right. I need a clicker. And when I have to work from a keyboard, I sometimes forget that I'm supposed to be clicking. So I will try to keep up with myself as I move through these slides. But the first part is called New Covenants, remembering our individual and collective humanity together. I have spent a good deal of my academic life thinking about the place and work of spirituality and remembering in an academic life and the power that that has, very particularly in the lives of African American and Black people. And tonight I just want to just sort of say out loud, I am African American, so I talk about African American people. But I think there are some real resonances with some of the things that you all are talking about here in Canada as well, with folks who have traditionally been marginalized from schools and society. So this is the experience I know well. I hope you can take away from it the things that you need. I've argued that remembering is as much about recollection as it is about marshaling knowledges and ways of being and thinking in the present to do a particular kind of work, a kind of agency taking. This talk tonight rests in the urgent need to remember, that is to recall and to put back together again, and is centered in the covenants that we've made as educators and leaders with ourselves and with each other. Now, many of us think of the notion of covenant as something holy, something that guides a particular religion or a particular doctrine. And the covenant here about teacher diversity in education asks that we start our conversations by making explicit the informal, solemn, and binding agreements that we have either explicitly or maybe even unknowingly made in relation to who we are as teachers, who we should be, and where we are in our profession today. It is the desire, my desire especially, to unpack a painful paradox that is embodied very specifically in an often unknown essay by James Baldwin entitled A Talk to Teachers. He states this: I decided very early that some mistake had been made somewhere. I was not an N-word, even though you called me one. But if I was that in your eyes, there was something about you. There was something you needed. I had to realize when I was very young that I was none of those things I was told I was. I was not, for example, happy. I never touched a watermelon for all kinds of reasons that had been invented by white people. And I knew enough about life by this time to understand that whatever you invent, whatever you project, is you. So where we are now is that a whole country of people believe that I'm something and I don't, and the battle's on. Because if I am not what I have been told I am, then it means that you're not what you thought you were either. And that is the crisis. We need new covenants, new agreements and relationships in our teacher education institutions and professions and in our own minds and hearts as part of these communities in order to unpack Baldwin's righteous claim. And his words, while specific to the condition of Black people in our nation, and very particularly in the United States, they are echoed in the continued bad faith sometimes with which institutions like my own enter into covenant with our Native, Indigenous, Asian, and Latino brothers and sisters as well. Webster suggests that a covenant has two parts. First, it is a written agreement or a promise, usually under seal, between two or more parties, especially for the performance of some action. But secondly, a covenant is the common law action to recover damages for the breach of such a contract. In other words, a covenant requires repair. So a starting place that is also foundational for conversations about the possibility that is education might begin with a different question. What are the agreements or promises that we have made that operate fundamentally with racism and all the other injustices of power at the center, and that keep us from being in community with one another? In other words, what covenants have been made to uphold the claims and the chasms that continue to marginalize some and center others in our schools and in our schools of education, for example? How about the ways we normalize the discourse of whiteness such that we honestly believe and act in line with that belief that there are just no teachers of color available, and that by default, our colleges and schools of education are primarily white, primarily middle class, primarily female, and from communities with little ethnic or racial diversity? Can we unpack the covenants between the institutions where we work and teachers representing various social identities and racial and ethnic cultural identities? Those between who we say we are and who we say we want. To that last question, what are the promises that we've also made to inadvertently, unconsciously, or blatantly exclude racially and ethnically diverse populations? And most importantly, are we willing to acknowledge our own lies, collusions, and exclusions in the covenants we've made? Our conversations tonight is at its core about truth-telling, and such truth-telling of the unknown herstories or histories, inequitable practices, and the deliberate work of racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. that reside in different measure in each one of us will require sitting in often unflattering and difficult light of another story with humility, compassion, and honesty. But an equally critical part of this conversation must also be about the second part of the definition of covenant, about Baldwin's characterization of the crisis that we continue to exist within. Said as a question, what are the common law actions that we must take to recover damages for the breach of covenants that we've made in education, that we've made in our institutions, that have kept so many from engaging the possibility that is education? To examine these questions, I'm suggesting here that we all, every one of us, have to do the work of remembering in order to stand fully in our humanity, which is a cultural, spiritual, and epistemological work. But we also must remember to seek an audacious freedom, a cultural, spiritual, and praxis-oriented way of work. We must remember that the work of remembering and honoring our diversity is not only about the colored folks. As I recently shared in an interview with a white colleague where she was very pointedly asking for a specific definition of this thing we call diversity. What I know is that whatever diversity is, however we define it, it has got to get off of my body as an African American onto both of our bodies with the goal that that diversity thing, eventually rests comfortably between us. That is the possibility that is education. I want to share some truths, remembrance of Black life and experience with education, with schooling, with teacher education. These stories speak to what happens when Black and other people of color, people of generous spirits that honor our collective cultures and covenants, when we arrive and depart from the shores of our educational experiences, typified by formal schooling contexts. And again, I'm speaking of the U.S. I think you all in Canada have this all figured out. As I share these stories, I ask that you consider two things. One, the way these stories embody those very problematic and unhealthy covenants that keep us from the possibility that it is education. And two, the ways that these stories either map on or don't map on to your own educational experiences in ways that help you to understand the covenants that you have made that either help or hinder the possibility of education as well. I also ask that you consider and try to conjure what new agreements or covenants might be necessary in their own contexts to really transform the relationships between schools and communities and students and teachers in a way that would center the whole student. Because whatever education means in this moment, post-pandemic especially, it is about creating contexts that honor the ability and the spirit of all of us to stand fully in who we are as a community and to stand in that space with the audacious freedom that education requires. So this next section of the paper I call We Remember Our Humanity Despite Our Education. And I want to share two stories. One is a story that I wrote when I was a doctoral student as part of my comps exams. The question that the committee asked me to write about was how I became literate. And I couldn't come up with a way to write about that with the exception of writing it in prose, so I did. And so I share that with you as a way of introduction, but also as a way of sort of thinking deeply about kinds of educational experiences that some of our students are having with us. The second story is a story of myself and a young woman who was in one of my teacher education courses that I taught at the University of Georgia, and I'll share a little bit more about that later. So this piece is called A Literate Life. I was born a Black child in a Black family. My parents loved me and I them. They introduced me to 4 sisters and a darling baby brother who loved me and I them. They all taught me things, my sister especially. She liked all those books that people dropped off at our house. My mom and dad didn't have enough money to buy them because you know you can't eat books. I didn't like books. They didn't say anything to me. Sally, Dick, and Jane, those were the readers I was reading at that time. Didn't look anything like me, and I didn't read too well, but I could write, and so I did. I write on the sidewalk with a big piece of chalk, Cynthia. That was my name, and I knew it because my mom told me I spelled it right, and I wrote it well. My sister kept on reading, and I kept on writing. I went to school when I was 6 with my sister and my pencils in my Barbie lunchbox. I liked Barbie. She was real pretty, and I wanted pretty hair like hers, not kinky like my own. I went to the kindergarten room. There were lots of kids in there, Black ones and Chinese ones and white ones, and some that were all mixed up. And there was Mrs. Jones, my teacher. She was Black like me, and that made me happy. And she liked me, and I her. One day I wet my dress, and a little white child boy called me a stupid N-word. I remember Mrs. Jones grabbed his arm and made him apologize. And he said he was sorry. And we were friends after that. But when I told my mom about what happened in school, because she always asked, she said, when someone calls you that name, you just hold your head up, because that's not what you are. Any color, those folks can be any color. But they're people who don't care about themselves or nobody else. You get your education and you prove to them that that's not what you are. You hear me, girl? And so I did. I learned how to read pretty well. Mrs. Jones had us reading to each other every day. I left Mrs. Jones' class of different colored kids and went all the way to middle school, and suddenly I was the only Black kid in my school. Well, there were 2 other Black girls. One was really bad. She was always in trouble. So I didn't hang around with her. And one thought she was one of the white girls, so I didn't really understand her either. Mom always said that no matter how hard I tried, that our skin would tell on us. And my teachers would say that everybody is the same and equal in everything. But when I asked if I could write about Malcolm X, and my teacher said no because we were writing about Martin Luther King during Black History Week, I couldn't understand. Why was it only a week? I thought my history went on every day. Then I went to high school, and I was real popular. I went to everybody's parties because I could fit in with all of the groups. But debate was my thing. Because I could choose who I wanted to read. I could choose who I wanted to write, or I could even write something myself. Delivery was easy because the stuff I was reading sounded like me. And I wasn't nervous because of what my mom told me. Head out, Cynthia, hold it way up, girl. We are so proud of you. Then I started college. The Ku Klux Klan tried to run me out. They scared me. Even as I tried to be brave, there was a little tiny voice inside of me kept saying, be strong. Like Sojourner Truth, like Martin, like Malcolm, be strong. I used to sing spirituals, Negro spirituals, on my way to campus. They made me feel better and reminded me of home, the place I came from, and the place I was going. And now, fast forward, I'm at Seattle University, a Black woman dean in a predominantly white space. That little voice, it's still inside of me. Be strong, Cynthia. Be strong. I'm still in a place where I'm often the only Black person in the room, on committees, on commissions, at receptions, but I'm sharing myself with the rest of the world. I'm writing life now and reading it too. Through all of these trials and tribulations, I know I've got something to say. It sounds like me. It is me. And people need to hear my voice tell my story. So this second story I mentioned is, I call a Black child's quilt story, how we make it on the scraps and bits. It's set in a nearly all-Black elementary school in Athens, Georgia, in the U.S., where I served as a part-time professor in residence in teacher education. That's a fancy way of saying that I often offered professional learning for the teachers at this school. I often taught my own teacher education classes at this school, and I also did some consulting with them as well. While teaching at the University of Georgia, I was part of a district-wide effort to engage students in art and inquiry through a 6-week program of short classes called Clusters. Clusters were designed and led by teachers and other school professionals and focused on everything from robotics to jewelry making. Students were allowed to select the cluster that they wanted to take. I decided to offer a quilting cluster focused on the cloth traditions of Ghana, where I spend a good deal of my time, and designed to get kids, in this case, 8 little Black girls and 1 little white girl, to talk about their lives. In fact, that was the title of my cluster, The Fabric of Your Life. The students were given the task of first creating a short story about their lives, focused on the 4 sections of their quilt square. The guiding questions were as follows, and these are questions that we too seldom ask others and ask ourselves. Where are we from? Who are we now? What do you want to be in the future? And what is a symbol of your life? So this is, what you're seeing here is a quilt square that a young woman created. And I was particularly intrigued by this young woman who brought a piece of cloth from home to incorporate into her quilt. She said, it's a piece of cloth that my grandpa gave me. Her bright eyes only matched by the grin from ear to ear. I share here the story she wrote from her quilt square. I am from Homer, Georgia, and I'm the last child of 6. I had 1 brother and 4 sisters. I moved to Athens, Georgia when I was 3 years old. Our house was too small to raise me. That is what is represented in my first square. Square 2 says that I'm now an artist. I draw what I love. I draw my name all the time. My 3rd square says I want to be an artist in the future. I'm always told that I draw well, so I hope that I can be an artist when I grow up. My last square is my grandfather's first letter in his name, the letter D. I loved him. The D is made of a bonnet he gave me when I was a baby. The center is what I will try to do my whole life, and you notice that at the center of her quilt, there is a heart signifying love. This is what my quilt says about me. Now, during the 5th week, one of the African-American teachers in the building came in to see the girls working on their quilts. She rocked around as the children were working and stopped and looked at this young girl's quilt. And she said to the young girl, I don't know why you want to be an artist. They don't make any money. She goes on, it's nice and all, but why do we have to use those African symbols? The young girl, to her credit, explained that she liked the symbols. They have meaning, she says. These are symbols from Ghana. They have meaning, she said, like wisdom and knowledge. This one's my favorite, pointing to the Akan symbol. I don't know if you can see it here on the bottom. Mati Masie, which means what I hear, I understand. At that point, when, after all these questions from the teacher, I looked up and smiled at the young girl who I knew had been working so hard on this quilt and memorizing that particular symbol and its meaning. And I eyeballed the teacher as she turned and wandered out of the room. A few minutes after she left, I walked over and put my hand on the girl's shoulder. She turned to me, smiled, and said, I think my grandfather would like this. And that's what matters to me. So, given those voices, what are the new covenants for the possibility that is education? And I want to sort of argue that beloved community, or thinking about beloved community, might be one of those possibilities. But I want to start with a quote from a book that everybody in this audience should read, go out and buy. I should be giving royalties for all the copies I swear people should buy. But it's a book by Angie Thomas. You may have seen her film, actually. This book was made into a film called The Hate You Give. But this is a quote from her, the front of her book. It says, not that one. Oh, it's at the bottom. Sorry. She said, that's the problem. We let people say stuff, and they say it so much that it becomes okay to them and normal for us. What's the point of having a voice if you're going to be silent in the moments you shouldn't be? So in 2018, we invited Angie Thomas to come to the University of Georgia, and we read the book, The Hate You Give. Again, commercial announcement, go and get it. Coupled with a number of frightening encounters that I myself had had with law enforcement when I was living in the Deep South in Georgia, this book changed my life. It helped me understand more deeply the current wave of state-sanctioned violence against Black folks, especially in the U.S. again, recognizing that where I am right now. And why movements like Black Lives Matter are critical to resist such violence. And this incredible book speaks so clearly to this moment, a moment right here, right now, that might be characterized as being between two covenants, the old and the new. It is also fundamentally a moment where the spirit and humanity of those historically characterized and relegated to the margins is choosing to talk back, to speak back, to act, to demand to be. Unfortunately, reports of violence against those demonstrations of humanity often go a little something like this. These are benevolent and innocent law enforcement officers who, only attempting to be useful, helpful, to do their job in economically poor, often communities of color, in line with their stated covenant to protect and serve the public. Sandra Mosley's death just recently at the hand of law enforcement is but a recent example. But as Star, the young African-American protagonist in this book, The Hate You Give, states, here's her slide. Funny, slave masters thought they were making a difference in Black people's lives too, saving them from their wild African ways. Same shit, different century. I wish people like them would stop thinking that people like me need saving. Our well-being and audacious freedom is a mutual one between young and old. So we need these new covenants with young people in our nation and in our schools, promises that would invite a whole different way of being together in our quest for equity. They are the possibility that education is right now. It means making new agreements with youth and their futures, having real talk about equity. The stories shared earlier are instructive in thinking not only about the specifics of how to do it, but why and how we are mutually bound up, not only in our memories and remembering, but also in making our next steps meaningful and worthwhile for all, and very particularly for those who have been most harmed by the covenants we've lived within. Some questions from those stories that I shared in the second part. How would life have been different if the little black girl, myself, had lots of different teachers, including more black teachers in her life? How might she have learned to love reading as spaces of possibility, of fugitivity even? How might her struggle for identity have been enhanced in her education if she could have seen herself in the instruction? Do you all know how hot it is up here? 1 minute. I didn't intend to do a striptease, but what the heck? All right, so how might her struggle for identity been enhanced in her education if she could have seen herself in the instruction, in the materials, in the experiences of schooling, if she wasn't yearning for identities and humanity that wasn't hers? What could she have learned from those who were interested in her whole person? From the second story, imagine the expansiveness of the little black girl's imagination of knowledge of Africa and the diaspora had been made available to her. Imagine what was missing or distorted in the black teacher's personal and professional identities as she interacted with the young girl. What would have been possible if this young woman could have pursued her passion for the arts, not solely in an extra experience like these particular classes were, but as a regular part of her curriculum, maybe even in all of the subjects she was studying? So I want to spend this last few minutes talking about an initiative that we have begun at Seattle University that is, of course, grounded in our mission as a Jesuit institution, grounded in our why, and it is our attempt to transform the covenants that we have with a number of public schools across the state of Washington, in partnership with a large philanthropic foundation based in the state. Some of you may have heard about them, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It rests not only in our college's deep and abiding commitments to joy, justice, and Jesuit education, but it also rests in greater diversity and equity between us. Our work rests in several core beliefs. One, we believe that all students and families deserve access and opportunity, not unlike many beliefs of those of us in the room. High quality, culturally relevant education that cultivates their genius, potential, and humanity. We believe this is accomplished best in a community that cares about them. But the global COVID-19 pandemic, racial inequity, and growing societal divisions have left us in the U.S. and U.S. school personnel with increasing learning and mental health challenges for themselves and for their teachers. Further, these same realities have stretched our engagements with community without adequate supports, without adequate cultural knowledge, and without meaningful relationships with schools. Now, research tells us that the success of every student relies primarily on learning from teachers who know and care for them and are competent in their subject matter. However, many loving, well-meaning educators and school personnel do not have the skills, knowledges, and experiences to work effectively with diverse groups of students from a position of strength, right? So this mismatch is causing increasing teacher turnover and burnout and lack of success too often for many of our students. And it's hit BIPOC educators, what we call teachers of color, and students of color disproportionately in public education, whether we're looking at traditional public or public charter schools. We believe the global nature of the pandemic fundamentally changed teaching and learning, and the relationships needed to effectively do both. Thus, in this moment, we need to reimagine public education in ways that serve these new realities, is good for the whole public, that includes our global community, and ensures a strong future for all of us, especially those engaged in public education. Now, we have started a project, is that it? Yeah, that is foundational, whose foundation is in the work of Dr. King. The project is called Public Education and Beloved Community Initiative, or what we call PEB-C. It relies on Martin Luther King Jr.'s notion of beloved community, and it's a way to honor shared humanities, recognizing past hurts as a way of knowing and being together. So I'm going to just sort of very quickly run through some of the tenets that this work rests on. So Dr. King talked a lot about a strong awareness that one is a citizen of the world. That no matter, today especially, no matter where you are and what you're doing, you live in a world. You have an address someplace, maybe, but you live in the world. Understanding that freedom, everybody wants freedom. It's an internal desire. And it's important for us to sort of cultivate that the work has a basis in nonviolence and acceptance. And this fourth one, in understanding that whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So it might not be the case that it's happening in my community, but you can bet it's going to come back to haunt and also challenge the kinds of work that we're doing in any one of our schools and communities. A recognition that we're each unique, and in order to realize our need of one another, so we need each other. Finally, understanding that the citizen must be judged not by the color of their skin, but we heard this in his famous speech, but the content of their character, and awareness that all people have been psychologically damaged, and especially in the United States, by this construct of race, but it was a worldwide project. But Black folks especially must no longer be ashamed of being Black, which also means that there's a lot of truth-telling that still has to happen. And then this idea that all labor has dignity. So here's what we're doing in this project, which if you can't tell already, I am so excited about. First, we were asked to choose a purposely diverse network of public schools, publicly funded charter schools, as well as traditional charter schools. So there are 9 schools across the state of Washington in this project. And our work is to reimagine public education in beloved community, transforming the relationships necessary between schools and community. The ultimate goal is to increase the odds for success for diverse teachers and students across the state of Washington and beyond. And we're doing that with three sort of goals in mind. One is that we purposely chose these schools, right? And they represent big schools, small schools, schools that are in predominantly urban settings, schools that are in rural settings, schools that are focused on global education, schools that are focused on other types of education. We also have tribal schools. We have, who else is, we've got a diverse set of schools. But our goal is to say, it's difficult to understand beloved community unless you are experiencing beloved community. So how do we actually do that together? But with 3 goals, the strengthening and clarifying of the missions of public education. So we're going to have a lot of conversations about what is the mission of your particular school? What should be the mission of public education? We also hope to build relational capacity of teachers and leaders. What we're seeing in our own work and in our own relationships with schools is that whether it was the pandemic or otherwise, we're having a hard time talking back and forth between community and schools. And so trying to strengthen that and build in the metrics for success based on what the community believes the metrics of success should be. So one of the beauties of this project is that we get to utilize evaluation measures and assessment measures that are not traditional. There will be art and creativity as a part of the metrics. There will be a particular project that each school crafts for themselves in line with their communities around how we see ourselves in relation with one another. There's more, but we can maybe talk about it later. But when we were putting this project together, one of the most beautiful parts was that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation said, we're not sure how to assess success. And A, that was an incredibly humbling thing to hear from them. But B, it also provides us this opportunity to say, local communities, schools, can we define success in multiple ways and in ways that are in line with the goals of the particular community that you are a part of. Those, I just shared the goals. We do have a check-in metric every quarter where we meet with teachers and leaders who are a part of this project. And these are the dimensions that we are actually studying. So if you're going to be in a beloved community, you got to be in there with love. And so the 4 dimensions, how are we deepening one's knowledge of oneself and one's love for oneself? How do we think about that in terms of our love for others? Our love as a community practice, not just something that we do only for ourselves, but in community with others. And then in what ways do we see love in a bell hooks kind of way, infused with power? And how do we see deepening sorts of commitments to that? I'm going to skip over that part. I wanted to get to this particular slide because I want to end here. I haven't shared much about the project. We're just now constructing it, but we're constructing it in council and community with the schools that are a part of it. But I think the thing that's really exciting about it is this idea that we have the commitment and the covenant to work with community. Like, that's not an option anymore. It's something that we must do. While such a framework isn't just for Black people and not solely a covenant between Black people, it does recognize the need for us to, and other people of color, to serve as the experts on their own culture. And their own knowledges and their own experiences in relation to those with whom we interact. These are what I love this slide because they remind me of the shared containers that all kinds of heritage lives within and can be stored within. Dr. King's notion of beloved community is centered in this idea that we've got to have these shared containers. So as we think about the professional development and educational development that is the very embodiment and enactment of diversity we say that we want, it seems worth examining a beloved community sort of model or framework as a new possibility for what's possible in education. In closing, my hope this evening is that you might reflect on and be moved to change as an educator with beloved community as your goal, as a transformative possibility that education can be when it rests in a very different set of relationships and promises and covenants with deep respect for community. The call is for us to build some new practices, relationships, and covenants that honor all of our humanity and teach in a way that recognizes the strength, the courage, the wisdom of all of our students, too often arising, so many of them coming from spaces where oppression, violence, and trauma have been their norm. But that strength, courage, and wisdom also arises from joy. I do want to remind folks. Let us nourish that goodness as the ground that might alleviate continued suffering for others. Opening space for voice, power, and choice for young people that we work with and for ourselves. We be the space where education of our whole selves is possible. Mind, body, and spirit. I think our young people in our communities deserve no less from us. Thank you for your kind attention. And I look forward to questions.
So I want to thank Cynthia for sharing with us her stories and reminding us about courage and strength that we need not only within ourselves for the possibility of education, but realizing that we amongst ourselves have great courage and responsibility for the possibilities, the wonderful possibilities of education. As mentioned earlier, we're going to have a question and answer time at the end of our two speakers, and please remember there's also, at the end of that, an opportunity to have more conversations with both Joel and Cynthia. We will have some treats in the entryway there, We have that from, who's our, Walnuts. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Darke. So we have walnuts catered, and we have a cash bar. So we have a wonderful opportunity for gathering and chatting after. At this time, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joel Westheimer. Joel is professor and former university research chair in democracy and education at the University of Ottawa. He's also an educational columnist for CBC Radio, a member of the National Academy of Education, and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. Dr. Westheimer is an expert in civic education and the role of schools in democratic societies. His books include What Kind of Citizen? Educating Our Children for the Common Good, second edition, and Pledging Allegiance, The Politics of Patriotism in America's Schools, forward by the late Howard. He has delivered more than 350 keynote speeches, nationally and internationally, and is a regular contributor to newspapers and magazines, including the Washington Post, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and the Toronto Star. Please welcome Dr. Joel Westheimer.
Wow, what a lovely introduction. Hello, everyone. I really want to thank Mark Spooner for inviting me, and of course, James Nahachewsky, and everyone who made this possible, including Jamie and Tyler, who are helping making sure things run here. It's always an honor to be able to come and share ideas with people, and hopefully in the question and answer period to hear a little bit about your thinking on these things too. I also want to thank Anna-Leah for her wonderful welcoming to this sacred space. Anna-Leah talked about all the doctors in her family, and that reminded me of when my daughter was 11 years old, and we were standing around with some friends, and my daughter Nicole said, you know, I want to be a doctor. And she'd always wanted to be a doctor since she was like 2. And one of our friends said, well, you know, your parents are both doctors. And she said, no, I want to be the kind of doctor that helps people. We're in person. I love that. I'm still getting used to it, even though it's now been some time since the pandemic, because it's weird. Since the pandemic, we've all decided it's better to be at home in your bedroom than together in the real world, right? So much happens online that doesn't have to. And then we all get depressed and lonely and fat, because that fridge is right down the hall. There is literally an epidemic of loneliness in this country and in many others among both children and adults, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that we don't have to be around other people. So I am really glad to be here. By the way, you know, school children ages 8 to 12 spend about 4 to 6 hours a day on screens. And teens spend up to 9 hours a day on screens. So it's really lovely to not be on a screen and to be here in person. And you know how I know that we're not online and in person? Because I have pants. And all of you are wearing pants, so it's good. You know, there were a few things I liked about the pandemic, actually. At the very beginning of the pandemic, the person who was organizing our faculty meetings only had the free version of Zoom, and so after 40 minutes, it would just disconnect. So our faculty meetings were limited to 40 minutes, and I learned that no faculty meeting should ever be more than 40 minutes. So it was great. Also, it made everyone realize how important the work of teachers is, right? It made everyone remember that. It really made the public appreciate teaching again. You may remember some of the memes that were going around. There were things like, homeschooling, day 2, we must double our teachers' salaries. Or homeschooling, day 5, I must remember to tell the teacher, to apologize to the teacher for saying that Susie was gifted. It was great, and there was, I remember seeing another one with a sign on a door, a house door, that says, if you see my children outside and the door is locked, mind your own business, they're on a field trip. The pandemic also served as an X-ray. It helped expose so many things in society, so many problems that we already knew were there, but that were made newly visible by the inevitability of sharing certain things that we had to in the pandemic. Teachers and parents literally were brought into the rooms of the students, their bedrooms of the students. We could see some students had brand new laptops and they were sitting in their own room with a desk and a chair and books behind them. We saw other students who had to share computers with their siblings or with their parents who were crowded into some room or who were in a closet finding space for things. We saw the inequalities on our screen. We always knew these things were there, but we saw it pinned in the vernacular of Zoom so that we couldn't deny them or ignore them. There was a lot that was made visible during the pandemic. We also knew that there was a problem with emphasizing coverage instead of content, right? Nobody could keep up with so much less schooling than they had before. If there were 2 words that I could have banned from the English language during the pandemic, they would be learning loss, because they stated the obvious, right? I mean, people are falling behind, but falling behind who? The entire world had stopped. And learning loss implies that the students who are currently missed 6 months or a year of school are behind students from a similar cohort 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, this is obvious, right, and not helpful. Because of course what happened is that middle class parents went out and formed learning pods and got tutors and did all kinds of things to make sure that their kids didn't fall behind. Whereas other parents who were first responders holding down 2 jobs couldn't do all those things. And so the pandemic, we now know, ended up widening the achievement gap. So every time we said learning loss, the result was a widening of the achievement gap. We also learned about the centrality of relationships and in the life of the classroom. And this has a lot to do with the beloved communities that Cynthia just talked about, and I'm gonna talk about. We learned about the challenges facing education, but we also learned about the possibilities. During the pandemic, the impossible became suddenly possible. All of a sudden, we've had the intractable problem of houselessness, with people on the street, unable to find places to live and unable to be helped. But in many countries around the world, suddenly, they were all swept off the streets and given homes. Hotels were converted, apartments were given over. And it was not long lasting, but it was the impossible made possible. In schooling, overnight, we eliminated standardized testing. Again, it didn't last, but people had been trying to cut back on standardized testing, and many of us argued for eliminating them in some form or another for 20 years. And overnight, they were canceled. Tests were canceled, they were postponed, they were put off sometimes for 2 years. And in a different talk, I would talk about some of the effects of that, but some of those effects were positive. We also were able to reduce inequality in tech by delivering laptops to students' doors and making sure that in various ways that they did have high-speed internet to connect. It wasn't always successful, but that effort was made, and it was successful in a lot of places. And so the impossible was made possible, and that's what we're here talking about tonight, is possibility, the possibilities that are education. I teach a course called School and Society. I'm sure many of you have either taken that course or heard about it. And we examine the ways that forces in society affect schools and the ways that schools affect society. My students come to realize what teachers all already know. Schooling has endless possibilities for improving kids' lives and improving society. But they also learn that what happens in society happens in school, and that presents challenges to those possibilities. Contrary to what policymakers, business icons, and philanthropists would have us believe, teachers do not teach in a vacuum. They can't make society's problems go away by having higher standards or trying harder. They can't teach a boy who is hungry or a girl who slept in a homeless shelter that night. They can't teach children whose parents are underpaid and overworked and stressed. Teachers are often told that they shouldn't worry about problems like inequality, injustice, or apathy, that they should just stick to teaching what they do best, that if they have high enough expectations, their students will succeed regardless of what's going on out there in society, out here. But society's problems are teachers' problems. Society's crises are educational crises. There's no way around this obvious, but so often ignored truth. It's an ignored truth because it's an inconvenient truth. Inconvenient because it would require people to mobilize to change things that are difficult to change. It's much easier to just blame teachers. The possibilities for education are deeply tied to these social problems. But schools are also interestingly seen as a way to address many of those problems. And that's where the possibilities lie. So I'm going to make 3 points. The first is that schools must be places where relationships flourish and community bonds are strengthened. The second is that our current obsession with standardized testing and a focus on a very narrow set of curriculum goals limits our ability to pursue the best and most important possibilities. And finally, that schools must be crucibles of democracy, where students are prepared to take on their roles as effective citizens in our society. So let me start with the first point, relationships and community. For the last 20 years, the discourse around schooling has changed so dramatically that we have now lost a common vocabulary to talking about schools as anything other than job training institutions. That is not the historic ideal of what public education was about in Canada or the United States or elsewhere. Public education was founded on the idea that in order for a democratic society to flourish, we needed people to be educated. It goes back to that Thomas Jefferson quote, "If the people are not well educated enough to govern their own affairs, then the solution is not to take that power of governance away from them," I'm paraphrasing here, but to educate them. Schools, and I'll talk more about the democratic purposes of schooling in a few minutes, but schools used to be, and still are, of course, and still should be, about fostering connections between people from different backgrounds, building community, building relationships in the schoolhouse, in the classrooms, and in the schools. We want to increase students' sense of belonging and engagement. Schools should build community to increase that sense of engagement and connections to one another, in this time, especially in this time of extreme polarization. We want kids to learn social skills, especially this post-pandemic generation where those skills are now so often lacking. And we need to give teachers the time and space to build those connections. That might mean fewer curriculum expectations, more flexible schedules, and smaller class sizes. We need to get back to a language of education that is more than job training. I had a pamphlet that crossed my desk. It was like a booklet, and it said, the title was something like, "Job Training Skills for Kindergartners." I mean, as if, first of all, we could tell what jobs were going to be like in 20 years when they're, 15 or 20 years when they're looking for jobs, but also the grave injustice that does to the imagination and possibilities for education. Job training skills for kindergartners. Kindergarten should not be about job training. The school and the broader society benefit from a focus on relationships as well. We know from research that a focus on community and relationships reduces bullying. It improves school climate and culture. It increases student retention and attendance. There are decreased incidents of reported depression and loneliness, better health outcomes. decrease in polarization, increased civic engagement, and social responsibility. And so the first thing I want to make clear is that the possibility of focusing on relationships and community in the school is one that we cannot underestimate the importance of. It's the fundamental sort of goal that underlies everything else that we talk about around possibilities for education. But remember I said that I was going to mention also our obsession with standardized testing and a narrowing curriculum. Again, the last decades of school reform have seen the curriculum narrow to an emphasis almost exclusively on math and literacy, because those are the subjects that are tested. And that focus on math and literacy has taken steam and efforts and all kinds of resources away from other things that schools used to do, including even the other subject areas. So whole subject areas are now, months before standardized tests, hijacked in the service of preparing kids to raise their test scores on these standardized tests. The arts, maybe if there's time between standardized test prep, recess were shortened, drama eliminated in many schools, music, and on it goes. We've become obsessed with these test scores probably because it's something that we can measure. And so as human beings, we love these numbers attached to things like anything that we can measure. So we're pretty good at measuring 2 + 2 = 4, whether students can get that answer right. We're not bad at seeing whether students can decode the words of a sentence and read in that way. We're not as good at finding out whether students have developed a sense of creativity or passion or belonging, whether they know how to live in healthy relationships or lead happy lives, whether they feel that they can contribute something to our society and have a sense of engagement. Those are things that we're not so good at measuring, but we all love numbers, right? When the newspapers publish rankings of schools, if one school gets a 9.2 and the other school gets an 8.7, oh great. As a parent, I don't even have to visit these schools now to figure out which one to send my kid to. I'll go to the 9.2 school. Now, it's not that those numbers measure nothing. They measure something, but it's a little slice of what goes on in schools, right? It's just a narrow band. Even within those subject areas, math and literacy, I've never seen a math teacher who says, oh yeah, you know, those tests measure every single thing I do in my classroom. They measure everything I care about as a teacher. English teachers don't say that, so they measure a part of what's important in schooling. Let me get something out of the way right away. If you can raise your hand if you are a member of the Parents and Educators Against Kids Knowing How to Read. Yeah, there is no such group, right? There's no such group as Parents and Educators Against Kids Knowing How to Add Numbers. I say this because there's arguments leveled at progressive educators. Oh my God, that Westheimer, all he cares about is kumbaya and whether the kids can be happy together. He doesn't care whether they learn anything. Right? There is nobody, there are no teachers and no parents who don't care whether kids can learn how to read or whether they can add numbers. But many educators feel like that's not enough. It's not enough to know how to read. It's important for kids to learn how to know what's worth reading. It's not enough to know how to add numbers or get the correct change at a supermarket. It's important also to know what those numbers add up to, how they link to your life outside of school. And so it's important when we talk about the possibilities that are education to talk about the full spectrum of what is supposed to be learned in schools and what is supposed to be emphasized. Remember I said we get these numbers and so we start to care about those subject areas. It's because, well, you could say, if we can't measure the things we care about, we start to care about the things that we can measure. And so our focus gets narrowed. And you know, if you think about a little metaphor here, if you think about walking at night, let's say through the woods with a flashlight, if you don't have the flashlight on, you can sort of make out a little bit of what's going on around you. Maybe things are in the shadows, but you can see this tree, that rock, maybe that deer. As soon as you turn the light on and focus on something really narrow, you lose your sense of everything outside of that light, right? Everything becomes dark. And that's what we've done with our myopic focus on testing in math and literacy. So we need to loosen those bounds for teachers so that we can focus on broader goals. I'm going to spend the rest of my time here describing the importance of the possibility for schools in democratic societies in particular. First of all, as many of you know, we're experiencing an incredible diminishing of commitments to democratic institutions all around the world. Nearly 1 in 4 adults in Canada and the United States think that democracy is a bad way to run the country. The same proportion agree or strongly agree with this statement. I would like to live under a political system in which a strong leader could make decisions without being bothered with interference from Parliament or the courts. In other words, they want to live in an autocracy. But here's what keeps me up at night. Almost half of youth share that view. Now, we don't know exactly why youth are answering these questions in the way they are. The percentage of people and youth who say that they would like to live in a country governed with army rule has gone up. It's not anything like these numbers. We're not sure exactly why people are answering this way, but one possibility is that for the time that they've been in the conscious world, democracy has not been serving them very well. We see the impossible gridlock that is the United States Congress. We see both Parliament here in Canada and Congress in the United States not delivering on things that young people care about: climate change, education, funding for education, and so on. And so democracy has lost a bit of its luster. And of course, young people who are alive today came of age during this time. It's horrifying to think that there are young people who have only known a world with Donald Trump in it, but that's where we are. And of course, it's not limited to Canada or the United States. Hungary and Poland have the steepest declines in their democracy scores ever recorded by Freedom House. There's Viktor Orban in Hungary, there was Bolsonaro in Brazil, at least he was thrown out. There was Berlusconi in Italy, Geert Wilders in Greece, the Alternative for Germany party in Germany, Marine Le Pen in France. I could go on all night here, and this is really troubling because we're seeing this phenomenon all around the world. It's not a Trump phenomenon. Trump is a symptom, but it's something that's happening around the world, this failing of commitments to democratic institutions. Democracy, it seems, is not self-blinding. Now, what does that have to do with schools? Well, let me do a little thought experiment with you, if that's okay. If you can imagine for a minute that you were whisked out of this room and you went up into the air and you went through the air, through the roof of this building, through the air, through the atmosphere, through the stratosphere, and into space. And while you were in space, the Earth is turning below you, and it looks beautiful. And remember, this is a thought experiment, so you can breathe up there, you're not too cold. You're up there for a little while, but then you start to shake, and you start to feel yourself descending, and you descend through space, through the stratosphere, through the atmosphere, through the air. You see the town of Regina below you. No, sorry, not Regina. You don't know which town it is. But you are descending through space. You go through the ceiling of a building, through a couple of floors, and you end up in a classroom. But this classroom is somewhere in the world, and you don't know where. And again, because it's a thought experiment, let's pretend that you can't tell where you are based on the dress people are wearing, or the food people are eating, or the language that's being spoken. Here's my thought experiment. Here's my question. Would you be able to tell whether you had landed in a classroom? You watch a lesson for half an hour, okay? Would you be able to tell whether you had landed in a classroom in a democratic country, or whether you landed in one in, say, a totalitarian dictatorship, or a country ruled by a military junta, or a religious theocracy? Would you be able to tell? It's not a facetious question. I mean, I know that a lot of us would like to say, of course. I mean, are you kidding? Our schools in Canada here have nothing to do with the schools in China. And they would be completely different, right, in a totalitarian dictatorship. But when you think about it, a lot of lessons might be the same. The lessons in fractions or addition, the lessons in chemistry and balancing an equation, a foreign language, even parts of history, science. Many lessons would be the same. The life cycle of a glowworm. And so this raises another question for me, that it gets to the crux of what I'm thinking about. And that is, what, if anything, should be different in schools in a democratic country than schools in a totalitarian dictatorship? And let me just make this a little bit even harder, because here in the West we like to think of democracy good, dictatorship bad. But let's even break that down. Okay, the dictatorship we're thinking about is a benevolent dictatorship. In fact, I'm going to make Mark, if you don't mind, I'm going to make you the benevolent dictator. Okay? Mark has the best interests of the people in mind. Right? He's not squirreling away money to bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. He's not fomenting corruption by appointing his family members and friends to positions of power. He has the best interests of the people in mind, and he wants to do what's best. But remember, benevolent he may be, he's a dictator. So he's not interested in what other people think, except maybe a small group of advisors. What he says goes. Right? He issues a command, that command is followed. He issues a law, that law is followed. So in dictatorships, what are the requirements of citizens? Well, they're to be obedient, they're to not question, they're to still be nice to one another, do things that are good for their neighbors, and be good people, but they're not supposed to take part in making decisions about the best ways to live and thinking about policy, right? Because that's Mark's job. That's the job of the leaders of the country. Democracies require something different from their citizens. Democracies require that we are all engaged in the business of deciding how we should live. That we come together in the very least and weakest form of democracy to vote once in a while, to have representatives who represent our interests and our beliefs, to make decisions, but in a more robust democracy that we stay involved, that we are up to date on current issues, that we write op-eds to our newspaper, that we organize in our communities, that we protest when protest is needed, that we dissent, that we ask difficult questions. Right? These are things that don't belong in the totalitarian dictatorship, whether it's benevolent or not. So what's the role of schools then in fostering those skills, and are we doing that? Are we teaching the skills, the attitudes, and the knowledge that would allow students to engage in that way, in being effective citizens in our democratic society? Let me say that this is not a purely academic subject for me. A few years ago, this topic was on my mind when I stood in the Frankfurt Hauptbahnhof, the train station, waiting for a train to Prague. This was just before the pandemic. Both of my parents were born in Germany, my father in Karlsruhe in 1927, and my mother in Frankfurt in 1928. My father was displaced by World War II. He moved to Lisbon with his parents, and then to Louisville, Kentucky, of all places. My mother was less fortunate. Like my father, she left Germany before being sent to a work camp or a concentration camp. But unlike my father, she left her hometown without her parents on a kinder transport to hide in Switzerland. As I waited for my train in the station, I realized suddenly that almost exactly 80 years before, almost exactly, my mother had stood in this same train station and waved goodbye to her mother and her grandmother, who ran next to the train as it left the station. She remembers smiling so that her mother wouldn't cry, and she remembers giving her doll to a girl sitting next to her who was crying and disconsolate. They were two of 100 children on the train headed to relative safety in Switzerland. And that was the last time my mother would see her family. She was 10 years old. So what went wrong in German society that led to such unthinkable events as those that define the Holocaust? How could such a highly educated, mature democracy descend into such unimaginable cruelty and darkness? Historians, of course, have suggested a great number of causes, including Germany's punishing defeat in World War I, the suffering German economy after the Great Depression, and of course the populist appeal of a leader who promised to fix it all. But as an educator, I can't help but wonder what German schools might have done differently before Adolf Hitler's rise to power. What, if anything, should schools be doing today to teach children about civic participation, courage, and dissent? Now, I'm not implying that another Holocaust is imminent. I'm using this example both because it has personal resonance given my family history, and also because extreme examples have a way of making concerning trends visible. And we're seeing this concerning trend of diminishing support for democracies and rising support for autocratic leaders. Almost 90 years after Germany's democracy was replaced by a totalitarian Nazi regime, popular support for democratic governance is the lowest it's been in decades. So what do we need to do? What are the real possibilities for education? I think that we need to engage students in meaningful projects where they engage with one another across difference, where their academic learning is connected to social meaning, where relationship, caring, community, and well-being are front and center. In other words, schools should be places where students learn not just to comply, but to resist, not just to memorize, but to mobilize, and not just to succeed, but to transform the world. We need to teach students to ask difficult questions about the world around them. We need to teach students to be able to traffic in multiple perspectives. You know, we are in a culture now that treats politics as a four-letter word. Politics have become so ugly that when I say you're just being political, it's like I'm insulting you. You're a mudslinging candidate running for political office and you don't care about anything but your own advancement and power. But politics has a much more noble history. Bernard Crick wrote a classic book in defense of politics, where he said that politics are the way people in a democratic society come together to work out their differences and move forward towards social policy. That's a more noble definition of politics. We need to teach kids that version of politics, Politics aren't something to be kept out of schools, they're something to be brought in. And this isn't just in the social studies, but across the subject areas. The subject areas should be in the service of social meaning, as John Dewey often wrote and said. The whole school enterprise should be oriented around the idea of democratic community. And that is a great possibility for education. So let me close with some final thoughts about education's possibilities, and then I'm looking forward to our discussion. Education is not just about preparing students for a job market. It's about asking the fundamental questions. What kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of people do we want our children to become? And how can our schools be places where the seeds of democracy, equity, and justice are not only planted, but tended and flourish? Schools should be places where children and youth find meaning, community, and purpose, where they learn that their thoughts and actions matter, where they recognize that they are needed. Because public schools are not just schools for the public, but places where we learn what it means to be a public. They're a civic community made up of individuals with both shared and diverse identities. The possibilities of education are boundless, but they're not guaranteed. We live in a time when the purpose of education is increasingly being narrowed to metrics, test scores, and so-called outcomes that can be neatly plotted on a graph. But education has never been neat. It has always been messy, complex, and wonderfully and beautifully human. And it's precisely in that messiness that its possibilities lie. The possibilities of education are realized when we see our schools as sites of possibility, not simply preparation for a future life. When we treat our students as thinkers, not test takers. When we believe that education is not just about making a living, but also about making a difference. But to get there, we must resist the forces that seek to commodify learning. We must resist the voices that tell us that only what can be measured matters, that curiosity, imagination, and creativity are expendable luxuries. Education should be about teaching young people not only to read and to write, but to care and to question, to challenge and to change. It should enable each and every child to become the best version of themselves. So what's our job? That's really what this question of possibility is all about. We need to be inspired to ask not just what is now, but also what could be. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Joel. Wonderful and inspiring presentations by both of our guests this evening. And as I invite Cynthia back to the stage and Joel, we're going to just set up a couple of stools here. Individuals who are interested in asking questions, there is a microphone on my right, would be your left. If you could please just introduce yourself and ask a question if you have any. We do have some time for that. I do want to mention we've been gifting both Joel and Cynthia with prints. Those prints are by artist Jerry Whitehead from Peter Chapman Band, and they are minis. If you've been to the Faculty of Education on the, where do I work? Third floor. Thank you. The third floor, we have a Treaty 4 mural, and again, we are so honored to be not only working but hosting tonight on Treaty 4. And the mural that Jerry has done for education is entitled With Peace. So we have, much nicer chairs than I grabbed from backstage. I think we have one more, and we'll have both Cynthia and Joel. Mark bringing a comfortable chair? I'll bring out another chair. So we'll just have you.
Should we use this mic? Or should we just yell? Oh, no, but it's live streamed, I think.
This is what I brought, but Mark might bring something nicer.
Yeah, he's getting a more comfortable chair.
I was okay.
Yeah. Did Cynthia mention that it's unbelievably hot up here?
A comfy chair. Comfy chair. What is it you're supposed to discomfort and comfortable and
Something like that.
So we do welcome folks to come forward and ask questions if you have any. We also have, Joel has the microphone if there's anything that the two of you wanted to share between yourselves. But I think one of the themes that emerged for me is the importance of evidence. As I travel around the province, and I'm new to the role of Dean of Education here at the University of Regina and in the province of Saskatchewan, one of the things that I continue to be aware of is opinion online, opinion on radio talk shows, in terms of catching the ear and the eye of those who set policy and provide budget for the operations of education, both at the post-secondary and at the K-12 level. So if you have a moment to think about and talk about the importance of evidence within democracy and the possibility of schooling.
Yeah, it's a great question, James. We're in a very difficult time. Mark and I were talking all afternoon about AI and the sort of manufacturing of lies and the inability to tell reality from fiction. And of course, in many places, in particular our neighbors to the south, we have half the country living in a fictitious world with misinformation abounding. And so it seems like this is a time where it's even more important to double down on the idea that evidence and argument is important, and to make sure that kids learn the skills of discerning evidence from lies. But I'll just say one other thing, and then pass the microphone, is that I think that one of the ways we have to start by doing that is to do something that both Cynthia and I emphasize, which is create community in the classroom, right? Build connections between students, because you can't do it in a polarized classroom. You can't do it in a world where the other is seen as less than human or evil.
I think the one thing I would add to the conversation, I totally agree with you, is that I think sometimes we think we know what evidence is. I remember writing a piece years ago called "The Substance of Things Hoped For, the Evidence of Things Not Seen." That there are things in many communities that are evidence, but they have not counted as evidence in the context of schooling. And so I think we've got to figure out what are those things by being in community with community. What are those things that count as evidence for the communities that we are a part of? I think that's equally important to the idea of having folks who can be in dialogue and trust the evidence that is put forth. Yeah.
Thank you both. Seeing nobody else at the microphone, I'm going to take a chance for one more question. We're coming in. Okay, awesome.
There's microphones at both
sides.
Both sides. Sorry, folks. I didn't see one on the other side. They make them live.
Is that working? Hi. There we go. Thank you both so much for those fantastic talks. Am I supposed to say who I'm sorry? I was wondering, so something that you both said, it started with you, Dr. Dillard, in your talk. If you could say more about the metric, like love as a metric, because Dr. Westheimer, in yours, you were talking about, we don't, sorry, I'm going to get it wrong, but not being able to measure certain things that are important to us. And so I really want to think about and think with this idea of love as a metric, because it feels really exciting to me.
Yeah, we're leaning on, and this is the first time I've ever, this is 30-some years in the profession, been able to sort of think about love in that way, right? So we're using Tang's model of love. And what we're doing is, in the best traditions of qualitative research, thinking of a recursive process of deepening, right? So how does love, talk to me about how love shows up for you as a person. And we, as qualitative researchers are prone to do, will record and think and write and observe in those moments. Then a quarter later, we come back and ask the same question again. And we do this for 3 years. Right? How does love show up in community? What does it look like? What does it feel like? And we do that for 3 years. And I think the one that I'm most excited about, the question, is how does love show up as a sort of power of solidarity? My sense is that on the front end of the project, we'll have very little evidence, if you will, of those kinds of solidarities between school and community. But we're hoping by the end of the work, as they develop their own projects that require engagements and dialogues across both the school community as well as the community outside of it, that we would see deepened understandings of why power matters as a part of what we say love is, and how it gets enacted. So that's literally, and I think the thing that's so exciting to me is I never imagined someone funding something like this, right? Like we started out talking about metrics that we always talk about. How many teachers were served? What kinds of service did they receive? What percentage moved from point A to point B? But instead I said, what if we were to really try to think about measuring love? And measuring love in a sort of broader sense than just me loving me, but me in love and love in the bell hooks way, as an action, right? So I'm probably looking more forward to seeing the outcomes of teachers and watching teachers and leaders just get better and better at seeing their relationships and being in love with the community, both within the school and outside of it. But that's literally how we're measuring it. Now, in addition, one of the things I didn't say, and then I'll pass the mic too, is that this project is as much about kind of that particular metric and arguing that that there will be a deepening of people's understandings of love. But we also were really mindful of the fact that we have very few examples in social media, in media in general, where we see love enacted in classrooms and schools. We have such bad representations of schools. And so part of this project also includes a documentarian who will be following us through this entire 3 years to document what beloved community looks like, and developing a short 10, 15, 20-minute documentary at the end of this project. We also have visual artists, that is young people, who will be documenting in visual art what it feels like to be in beloved community. And at the end of all of this, our research work around love and our findings, the documentary of a new way of looking at school, and then the visual arts presentations of the students and their engagements in beloved community. I have to stay a dean for at least 3 more years because I want to see the outcome of this project. I've never been able to be a part of something like this, and so I'm really excited. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, sir. We have a question at this microphone.
Hi. I wanted to thank you so much for the incredible, beautiful, and inspiring talks you gave. We take great inspiration personally in teachers I know from the profound models of organizing we are seeing all over, but especially in Chicago, seeing teachers really stand up to fight and to say, if my students don't have housing, they cannot get an education. That is my fight. If my students come to school hungry, they cannot get an education. That is my fight. That is something I am willing to take to municipal government, take over the mayor's office if I have to, because we are getting trampled in the education sector. And currently we are facing elections here in Regina. We are seeing a far-right school board that is mobilizing and taking great inspiration. They want to make us into Florida. They have annihilated protections for trans students already. And that is without them being in office. They're gunning to take over the school board, and frankly, they will win if we do not mobilize. And so I would encourage people who are here, who are obviously dedicated to publication, to stand up and to fight for the school board and to fight back. And I would love to hear your strategies on what has been effective in taking back our schools from people who are fighting an obvious privatization agenda. Because we are lucky to still have public schools in Canada, but it is moving in that direction. We don't have charter schools, but it is moving that way, and our government has the complete ear of the SAS party is on the people who are gunning for the school board right now. So I would love to hear about your struggles, and again, I want to thank you so much for your talks. I think that was very profound advice that you gave.
Thanks for those comments and the question. First of all, let's hear it for the Red for Ed movement, right? We need more things like that. I think that unfortunately teachers' roles and all of our roles as educators, where we might have wanted to focus on classrooms and on teaching children, we still need to focus on that, but it's not enough. Instead of just public education, I think that all educators need to also focus on educating the public. Because the public has to be aware of these issues, right? The public has to know what schools are like and what it means to teach in a school and what kind of support and resources schools need. And so the kind of work that you're talking about and that you're asking others to do, I think is critically important. We all need to sort of be ambassadors for education to the public. And that's in addition to being engaged in all the obvious political ways and supporting teachers and supporting candidates who support education and make clear the damage that the ones who are trying to privatize education or to destroy public education, what their agenda is.
I too want to add my profound, actually, sense of where we're moving in education. I think one of the strategies we've sort of thought a lot about and have been enacting in Seattle has to do with coalition building across different types of schools. So low-key, part of the reason for this project that we're engaging in now is to get traditional public schools and private charter schools that are publicly funded to talk to each other. Because I think the things that are driving some of the leaders and teachers in some of these charter schools that are private entities but they are publicly funded are the same kinds of challenges that we're having in public education. We at Seattle University, as a Jesuit university, also have the good fortune, I think, in many cases, of having Catholic schools as a part of our sort of milieu of schools that we serve. And so there's a very different conversation that happens when you get Catholic educators, public school educators, and traditional educators all sort of walking in the same way towards a particular kind of outcome that is really much more broad-facing, much more it has a lot more tentacles than only working with our public schools. We have been intentional about working with all different kinds of schools because the problems are similar. And we didn't want the possibility of someone to say that public schools are the only schools that are worth saving. Private schools are the only schools worth saving. Catholic schools are the only schools worth saving. We wanted this coalition of schools. And so that's been one small way that we've been able to sort of speak back, but in a collective voice, in a way that doesn't allow folks to ignore, frankly, one sector or the other. But this problem is big. I'm not going to pretend that it's not something larger than that. And I am worried about November. That's when elections happen in the U.S., as you well know. I'm worried about November. At our local levels, at our state levels, at our national levels. So the points that you were making, Joel, about sort of where we are in this democracy and where we need to be, where we hope to be, are really, really hitting me tonight especially, because we've got a lot of work to do. And if all of us aren't engaged in some political campaign that is progressive, that is radical, that is critical, we all have to be engaged in that work, in whatever ways we can be engaged in it, because this is going to be a fight that we have not seen, at least I haven't seen in my lifetime. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Please do sign up if you're interested in organizing against. We are losing the school board, and I would like to not. So if people want to sign up for organizing that, that'd be great.
Thanks for the question. Thank you. We have another individual.
Yeah, thank you. So, as a budding psychologist and a mother of 3 girls myself, I wanted to just thank you for both talking about your own intergenerational trauma and the struggles that have led you to where you are. I wanted to ask, how do you continue to honor the legacies that you both carry and the work that you do while still cultivating space to still honor yourself and maintain that self-reflection?
If I understand the question, it's how do we honor legacies in ourselves and in, is that right?
That's correct. Thank you, Cynthia.
Okay. I think the biggest way and I'll speak for myself personally, I honor legacy when I show up fully. And the more full I can become by understanding history, culture, stories that have mattered to my family and to the larger families that I'm a part of, that's the way I hold legacy. I hold legacy by not forgetting that folks died and bled for me to have this opportunity to be here, to have this conversation with you. I honor legacy when I lift up the next generation of young people and youth who will have that same opportunity, or who should have that same opportunity that those ancestors thought about when they chose to live. So I think the more fully I can show up in my space as all of the people I am, the better chance there is, right, of legacy, that long length of incredible strength, courage, and wisdom can show up with me. And frankly, at this moment, we need all of that. We need all of that. None of us are strong enough. Somebody wrote the other day on my door. Folks are always writing stuff on my door. As a dean, usually it's good. But this, I thought it was profound. It was something that someone had read in Tricia Hersey's book, Rest is Resistance. And it said, another book that I would wholly recommend to you, but it said, my entire life is a collaboration. And when you ask the question of legacy, we are all collaborations of that particular long lineage of ourselves. So I can't show up as anything but myself. I name it, I claim it, I walk in that, and hopefully provide an example for others to do the same. Does that help? Does that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was beautiful, Cynthia. It's such a nice question. I'll just say one quick thing. I mean, I think that the legacy that I try and uphold is both for the things that have happened to my family and also for what my family has embodied is the pursuit of improving society and the pursuit of justice and teaching children that that's an important part of their lives. And of course, that's also what so many of us get meaning from. This is what, you know, the kids are so alienated and are struggling to find meaning, and yet any of us who have worked in struggles, political struggles, social struggles, know that that's such a source of meaning making and of relationships. And so I try and honor that legacy by conveying to my students and have my students convey to children and to do the work of teaching the importance of engaging and improving society and stepping up. And I'll just mention one pedagogical approach. This is just one of many examples, but of course there's many teachers who've had students do oral histories with members of their community. One of the more well-known projects was the Foxfire Project in Raven Gap, Georgia. And the kids did oral histories in their community with their parents or with community members. They documented these. They had a radio station. They had a national magazine at one point that was actually quite popular. And all of those brought the students' legacies and the students' histories into the fore for them and made them learn about where they came from and helped them make decisions about who they were and where they were going.
Thank you.
I think the one thing I would add is, you know, we can do the work of opening spaces, and young people, I think, are pushing us to do that kind of work. Like, I want to show up fully, and they're pushing us in all the most beautiful ways to honor legacy. But I think that's the larger question. Where are the spaces within the context of schooling where the legacy can show up? Not just our students, where their entire legacy can show up. It's that little girl in the quilt. That little girl took us all the way back to the continent of Africa. But there was no space, at least from that one teacher's perspective, there was no space for Africa to be there with her. And so I think that idea that kids are pushing us to say, I've got a long legacy, I've got a wide legacy, I want it all to show up with me when I come to school. And are we ready?
Thank you so much. And thank you for your question. We have, acknowledging that our evening is moving along very well, and we again are meeting just after in the entryway. We can have one more question.
Thank you so much for your words of encouragement in carrying on the struggle to make our world a better place. As you may have realized, Regina is a white supremacist settler colonial society. I grew up here. I went to a school called Davin, named for the man who brought residential schools to this country. We still have a main roadway in Regina called Dewdney, named for the man who implemented a starvation policy against Indigenous people in the late 1800s. Just a month ago, City Council chose to vote against changing that name. It would cost too much money. And I was thinking maybe the school system could use that as an opportunity to teach the real history of this place. They could talk about Dewdney. Maybe the students would become engaged in the activism. There is an Indigenous-led group that is calling for the change. They need more support. So maybe learn about Dewdney, teach it in the schools, and it would become part of the education system and part of educating us out of white supremacy. It took me, I lived in Sierra Leone for many years after growing up here, and that was the beginning of it. It's an ongoing process, never ending. The beginning of decolonization of my mind. Thank you once again.
I just want to give you a hug from up here. Because part of what you all also said was, we live in a place, and that place whispers to us every day. Sometimes it's screaming, it doesn't just whisper, it screams. And the degree to which we can ask young people to understand and know this place is the degree to which they will change this place. And that seems like good work for history. It seems like good work for social studies, although that's finding its way to the edges of things too. But it does feel like to me the strategy of asking us to know who was here before we were here, and the ways that those engagements and colonizations and oppressions and joy existed here, is to ask folks to sort of take this apart, take this thing apart. It's not going to be you or I who takes down these statues and these street signs. It's going to be the young people. But they have to know enough about the place where they are in order to do it. And that's on us. That's on us.
I love what you pointed out. I mean, the fact that when you make the world your classroom, you don't have to just lament at the way the world is, because everything in the world is fodder for education. When I first became a teacher, I was a middle school teacher in the New York City public schools, and I took over for another teacher midway, and she had already had this field trip planned to the USS Intrepid Museum, which is this aircraft carrier parked off the coast of Manhattan, which is full of cool fighter jets and army stuff that kids love. And I couldn't cancel this trip. They had already collected the money and everything for it. And so we went on this trip, and here I was hoping to improve the world and push back on some of these things. And we went in, and the very first slideshow that we saw was like one long be all that you can be commercial and a recruitment strategy for the military. And then there was all these representations of American wars from the obvious kind of nationalistic perspective. And I was beside myself, but then I decided to sort of flip it around. And I gave the students an assignment while they were going through this museum I had gone there before I took the kids and realized what it was. And so then when I took the kids, I gave the students this assignment to decide what was interpretation, what was so-called fact, and how might it differ if another country was telling these stories, right? And so we then did a 2-week kind of lesson on perspective and on what counts in that way. And so there's always this opportunity to turn things around and to use things as fodder for the kind of education that we want to practice. And I think some of those examples are, some of the things you talked about are good examples that these can be really valuable lessons for kids to engage with.
Do we have time?
Nick, you have one more question?
Okay. Are you guys hired?
We're professors. We'll be here all night. That's right.
We'll do one more question. Thanks.
Joel, my colleague and I were sort of thinking and whispering about what you were talking about with democracy and politics in our work as teachers. And there's the pedagogy side of it, but I think there's also like, what do we enact in our workplaces and in our society, like as members of this profession? And like, we had some legislation passed in Saskatchewan last year, anti-queer legislation that attacks the rights of queer kids in schools. And some decision makers like in our school division just sort of said, like the government did it, and that's that. We work with it, right? So my question is like, do you have advice or ideas of how to make it more normal within the profession to politicize our workplaces? Like, I think in a more democratic society, it would be very strange to work under conditions like that, but it seems to be normal in our current construction of the profession. So more teacher-facing, good advice on how to transform that professional identity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. It's a great question. And I think that the first step before we talk about political engagement is intellectual engagement, because there's this idea that teachers are sort of technocrats, right, delivering curriculum that is written by someone else to students, and they're supposed to like follow instructions. That's the public, often the public image of teaching, and we need to sort of recapture the idea of teaching as intellectually engaged activity. Once we do that, the intellectual engagement, it means that we can start to talk about what that intellectual engagement leads us to, which is engagement with the world around us, which is, of course, politics, right? And I think we do need to push back. I mean, it's just so frightening what's going on right now, right? I'd like to say it's just Florida. When I wrote the book that James mentioned, Pledging Allegiance, The Politics of Patriotism in America's Schools, that was after 9/11, and I had these quaint examples of places where teachers were told that they shouldn't talk about politics in schools. You know, these examples are ridiculous now when entire states, and it's not just Florida, are, you know, banning books, and it's just beyond what anyone could have imagined that we're here. And so I think it's all the more important. I'd like also to see work done with principals, because principals have to have teachers' backs. They have to run interference between pressures from outside the school and the work that teachers do. And I don't think enough work is being done with principals. We talk about, you know, enabling teachers to be political in that way, but it's principals that need to engage with that too, and not just respond to the hierarchy. So I'm not giving you, you know, specific ways to do it, but I think that everything you said is very important, and it's something that we. Oh, I will say one other thing, of course, which is teacher education. I think we need to engage these, especially with what's happening in the world. We need to engage these issues in teacher education explicitly. That it's teachers' roles to be engaged with educational issues, right, and issues that affect their students. It's part of the job now, and we can't escape it. And again, as I said, that's not all bad. It gives meaning to our work, and it will, you know, give a lot of meaning to people who are looking for that kind of meaning.
I want to add just one little word, because I do think that I so agree with you, Joel, that what we do is an intellectual enterprise, but as I've written as well, it's also a spiritual enterprise. That when we are going to fight, or when we are going to argue, or when we're going to protest, or when we're going to teach, or when we're going to learn, these are all things that are going to require something of us that's bigger than us. And so I guess I'm arguing for a kind of sense that teachers and leaders are going to have to also be well. And part of that wellness has to do with being whole, having spaces and places that you can go back to and get filled up and go back out and do it again. There's got to be these kind of refuges or sanctuaries that we as teachers and leaders have to have in order to do the hard work that we're engaged in right now. And so in addition to the intellectual, in addition to the political, there's got to be sort of spaces of wellness and wholeness that we also can return to, get filled back up before we go back out and do it again. I hope you all have yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your So we in the Faculty of Education, University of Regina, have just welcomed in around 350 students, along with community partners, SciTep and SunTap and YNTAP and First Nations University. It is within these individuals that we also see the possibility of education, because as we have amongst ourselves shared, we teach from, of course, our minds, but we also teach from our hearts. So again, thank you all for coming tonight. We will have a gathering just outside here, and look forward to future conversations. Thank you again for coming.